So, hello, Kamal. It's nice to finally be able to chat with you rather than text message all the time. I think to begin with, it would be great if you could introduce yourself to the listeners, who you are and what your area of speciality and interest is.
Thank you very much, Onik. It's pleasure to finally get a chance to speak to you in this setting. We planned this for some time, but finally we get the chance. My name is Kamal Makili-Aliyev. I work as a lecturer in Malmö University in Sweden. I also teach in Gothenburg University, also in Sweden. My area of expertise is international law and human rights. That's my primary area of expertise, and of course, I have a specialty there, which is the international law and conflict resolution, also a little bit of peace and conflict studies, and my regional area are the post-Soviet states. And if you connect those two, these are the conflicts in the post-Soviet states, and my conflict of specialty is the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict.
Okay, and perhaps I should, obviously, your name gives it away, but you're from Azerbaijan.
Yes, I'm originally from Azerbaijan.
So just we'll go into that in more detail. But first of all, I just wondered, seeing as it's now 15 months since the November 2020 ceasefire agreement, just where do you personally think Armenia and Azerbaijan are today?
Well, my personal opinion is that Armenia and Azerbaijan are right now on the path to the normalization of relations, and this sounds very hopeful. And I think it is actually very hopeful to where me and Azerbaijan are headed. I haven't been that optimistic for a very long time, but I right now see the signs that we are getting into the very careful, very cautious, very scary, but the path on some kind of normalization of relations uh, after 30 years of enmity between the two states. This is the first hopeful glimpse of a light that I see as credible.
Yeah, I think it's a pity that this couldn't have been resolved a long, long time ago, and sadly, the war happened. But one of the so we had the ceasefire agreement. Everyone knows what that is. And Aliyev, President Aliyev, quite openly said there's no reference to status. Armenians consider that status is an issue, and the Russians and others believe that it should anyway be deferred to a much later period when maybe the conditions are right for an actual discussion like this to happen. But this is really where your research or studies or interest is, right? How do you resolve the issue of the ethnic Armenians living within what's left of the former Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast? So I just wondered if you would like to introduce, how you're viewing this and whether or not you have any ideas, I guess.
Well, I do have an idea, and since I've been engaged in the research of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I did pursue that exact question of how would it be possible to negotiate a solution that would allow for the Azerbaijan to be able to maintain its territorial integrity, but at the same time would allow the Armenians to live in Azerbaijan within their own autonomous, so to say, autonomous solution that would give them both territorially, culturally, linguistic-wise, and uh, all the other issues in the complex, a, a space to develop, but within the borders of Azerbaijan. And one of the cases that have been coming up to my attention for a very long time until I finally engaged with it and did a comparative research between Nagorno-Karabakh conflict are the precedent of the Aland Islands. And those are the islands that used to have a strategic importance in the Baltic Sea and that lie between the Finland and Sweden and belong to Finland. However, in the beginning of the 20th century, and more precisely, right when all the cataclysmic events of the collapse of the Imperial Russia and the creation of Soviet Union started to happen, and with the independence of Finland from Imperial Russia, that question of the Aland Islands and their belonging uh, came into the front between the Sweden and Finland. And what happened there is that the population of the islands was historically Swedish speaking uh, for a very long time and had this a lot of the Swedish culture in it, and generally have been consisting of this very close and tight community with already um, a history of being quite autonomous, because the Åland Islands are an archipelago of islands with very specific ways of living and culture, etc., etc., but to which the Finland had a sovereign claim. Um, the Åland Islands and the Åland Islanders were very much concerned about the preservation of their way of living, and they have been concerned about what the main land Finland as a new state is going to turn out to be, how is that going to impact them, and they sought naturally the help of the kin state of Sweden to be able to protect them and maybe even regain the sovereignty which Sweden had over islands several centuries before that. And the conflict started brewing between the Sweden and Finland. There were deployment of troops, of both Finnish troops and Swedish troops, on the territory of the islands, couple of skirmishes, attempts of Finland to basically come up with kind of solutions with the Ålanders, which have failed, and the conflict started brewing. The real conflict started brewing between Sweden and Finland. At that time, the League of Nations, the predecessor of United Nations, have started a process of mediation between the sides, and that case was referred to the League of Nations by the states that have been at the core of founding that international organization, France and Britain. And it was a very interesting case that the League of Nations was able to settle through basically establishing an autonomous status for the Åland Islands and guarantees by the organization that this status is going to hold. And that autonomous status included several very, very important points. A very wide self-governing structures that would ensure that the Ålanders have enough power to be able to decide on the local issues themselves. There would be a connection to the state budget of Finland, so Finland would be sponsoring the autonomy. There would be all the preconditions for using the language and culture and preserving it. There was a special regime for acquisition of property on the islands, so that it wouldn't be possible to basically buy out the property from islanders and resettle it with a different, for example, Finnish-speaking population, and all that preconditions for the thriving self-autonomy. But also two other things: the minority rights regime and the focus on the neutralization and demilitarization of the islands. So to say that they will never be used in and for the military purposes. And if you are by now having uh, a little bit of a confusion to where and how does that relate to Nagorno-Karabakh, I think we would first start with pointing to the fact that, in the 19th century, Nagorno-Karabakh and Åland Islands were the part of the same state, Russia, right? And the withdrawal from that state is what created a lot of territorial questions. So right in the same way as the Åland Islands became a territorial issue due to the withdrawal of the empire, so have the Åland Islands. And in this sense, the roots of the problems of these territorial conflicts are very much on the same historical plane. But more than that, they ponder the same questions: the questions of autonomy, the questions of not being used as strategically by the regional states and by the greater powers for the military purposes, so that there would be some kind of a peaceful existence there, and of course the minority rights. And all that makes the comparisons between Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and Åland Islands, I think, very interesting, but also very revealing if you would take a look at my research.
Okay. I mean, and I understand all what you said. Of course, that's Europe and not the South Caucasus, where emotions usually get overcharged. And I'm not quite sure that anyone in Armenia or Azerbaijan is quite ready to consider these things. And sometimes I wonder if the situation is not just going to be bogged down for decades, and in much the same way that Cyprus and Northern Cyprus are. Am I being too pessimistic?
I think you are, and I also think that the comparison of the characters between the South Caucasus and the Nordic countries is very superficial. I would say at the emotional state that the Nordic countries have been, so like Finland and Sweden have been over that case, was no less dramatic that you would see in the Caucasus. I think it's this argument that the Azerbaijan and Armenia, not Sweden and Finland, um, doesn't stand to the scrutiny simply because the people are emotional about those things, especially when it comes to their own culture and to their own way of living and to the territory where they lived and which they perceive as historically important for them. And all those questions have been raised in during the case of the Aland Islands. What differs in the sense is not the people's emotions in those two cases, but how the states chose to handle it. And I mean to put the emphasis here on the states and not on the peoples, because to a certain degree, there is the end of the people's responsibility when it comes to the interstate conflicts. And the much more greater responsibility of the states as entities than the people's. And it's their choices, the states' choices, that will actually predetermine how the conflict is going to go. And it's exactly what happened in what is different in the case of Åland Islands and the case of Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, is because the choices of the states were not the same. And this is the part where there is a need for Armenia and Azerbaijan to start considering more and more the resolution of those issues in through the arbitration in the courtroom rather than through constant political bickering and sometimes fruitless negotiations where the sides claim absolutely opposite, so to say, they have absolutely opposite claims. Mm, this is exactly the situation that should be resolved by a court of law. And that would happen in the case of Åland Islands, basically. The court like structure of an international organization mediated, oh, I'm sorry, arbitrated between the, not mediated, arbitrated between the two sides and asked for them to agree to the decision before the decision was made. And both states went with that. And that was that difference, that political will that is needed to resolve the dispute. In much the same way, this can be done in case of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There is a possibility, and we already see that there are attempts to settle those things in the civilized way in the courtroom when it comes to the questions of discrimination against each other's peoples, right? So we have seen the cases going to ICJ. I think it's a very hopeful sign, right? That it is not this toxic political bickering and it's not just hand pointing that's going on. Let it be settled by the international court. And I think that can be also, as an experience, should be encouraged uh, and not criticized, and that such kind of a behavior, that civilized behavior, should lead to its extrapolation on the larger issues that we see. So we have a of international agreement on the table. We know what the sides need to do. Are there disagreements about it? Why not take it to the court? I'm not sure if everyone agrees to that or with that position, but that's what I firmly believe in, Onik.
So yeah, I remember now that you're a strong believer in arbitration, and yeah, we have had that precedent of the International Court of Justice. Perhaps it's interesting for listeners if you. So there hasn't been a final. decision or judgment, though, right? These are preliminary measures, which will then be, I guess, put out in more detail. But how do you enforce whatever the International Court of Justice decides?
That is a great question. I mean, the decision of the International Court of Justice has a strong moral weight by itself. So, whenever you have a decision of International Court of Justice, um, you're going to feel the pressure of other states in following this, because in each and every political opportunity, this case is going to be raised, and you, as a state, are going to be asked, have you fulfilled the requirements that the International Court of Justice put on you? True, the physical ways are very limited, and if the Security Council finds that going against the decision of the International Court of Justice is uh, threatening the international peace and security, the Security Council can take measures. So there can be a resolution about it, and the state can be, first encouraged uh, and then pushed into the action, into the implementation of a decision by Articles 41 and 42 of the UN Charter, first with the economic, non-military measures, and then even with the military measures. But that is, of course, and I do understand that this is a theoretical possibility. And in the cases of the discrimination, that might sound unlikely. But the political and moral pressure of this kind of judgment is huge. I mean, it's going to be constantly haunting a state not to follow on the obligations that come from the decision of International Court of Justice.
So, from a legal perspective, I'm also interested in this perpetual or perennial issue of territorial integrity versus self-determination. One of the problems with the Karabakh conflict has been this supposed contradiction. Although when we actually look into self-determination, we can talk about internal self-determination and external self-determination. Are these two concepts incompatible?
They are absolutely compatible. I think there is a misunderstanding, especially when it comes to the political scientists and the specialists in international relations. They misinterpret the norms of international law, and that's where the misconceptions come about. And then you have, of course, the journalists that also look superficially at certain issues and then feed that narrative into the media. The connections between the territorial integrity and the people's right to self-determination have been produced by the inclusion of both of the principles in the UN Charter. So the states, with basically saying goodbye to part of their sovereignty when they signed the UN Charter, wanted to ensure that is not going to be a wars of conquest. So after the World War II, so that the territory is not going to be a reason to invade another country. And that's where the principle of territorial integrity and inviolability of the borders came into the UN Charter, to ensure that the nation states will not go into the conquest wars. So one state is not going to be expanding its territory uh, on behalf of the other state. So this is the territorial integrity in principle. The principle of self-determination was put there in order to ensure that the peoples of the colonies can create their own states. So that they would be able to raise the question with the uh, former host state, the colonial state, and have a peaceful separation from that state to form their own states, because the concept of a nation state predetermined that peoples can determine their political faith on their own. And the whole idea of this principle is tied to the process of decolonization. Now, when the process of decolonization was over, and all the peoples that would like to use the principle have used it, with the various degrees of success also duly noted, but still, when the decolonization process was over, the question arose what to do with non peoples, with minorities, so ethnic minorities, national minorities, which are mainly located in Europe, religious minorities and linguistic minorities, because they, by definition in international law, don't have a right to self-determination, but they still have a sizable amount of minority rights. And then there was this concept, this academic concept of internal self-determination, that minorities may have a right which is not included in any kind of international agreements yet, but it is a quite valuable and, I would say, valid concept, that they do have a right to internal self-determination. So without uh, being able to raise the question before the state, before your host state, of separation, of external self-determination, they could raise the question of their linguistic rights, their cultural rights, their political autonomy in many ways, in order to be able to preserve the minority status and minority rights. And that is what we're talking about in case of Aland Islands, because that's how the internal self-determination basically started to function without even being accepted in academia yet, or even talked about in the political discourse, is when the League of Nations said that there should be a balance between the minority issues and the territorial integrity of the state taken to this matter, and the decision to grant a large scale autonomy without threatening the sovereignty of Finland was made. So basically, that was that expression of internal self determination. Another misconception about the external self determination is that it always means the right to secession, which is false. The whole idea of a principle of territorial integrity and the sovereignty of a state means that you cannot really do that on a whim. Otherwise, we could basically dissecate the state into the small entity that includes two people plus. I mean, so it's going to be infinite number of states can be created, limited only by the number uh, of groups of peoples of two in the world, if that would be true. So the idea of external self-determination is also not the right to secession, but the right to raise such a question. And if you want an example of that kind of situation, first, of course, is decolonization processes, because there was already a global political agreement that the colonies are going to go and become independent. And that's why they all raised those questions in front of the former sovereigns and negotiated divorces that went on with in South America, in Asia, in Africa, etc., etc., etc. And when it comes to the parts of the world that are even more disputable, for example, American Indians, uh, or in Sweden and Finland, there are Samis that live in Lapland areas of those countries. Those are indigenous peoples. They also have the right to self-determination. So theoretically, if they would raise the question about separation, the state needs to take that seriously and enter into negotiations with them if it would be possible to grant them ability to separate. The same thing happened in the case of Sudan when Sudan split in two. That was also a part of process of self-determination where you negotiated the separation with a host state, which is now called the Sudan, or the northern part of Sudan now have a South Sudan as an independent state. All those examples are the legitimate examples of the use of the right to external self-determination. And when we talk about the situation such as in case of Aland Islands and Nagorno-Karabakh, where we have ethnic and religious minorities or linguistic minorities, there the internal self-determination is this legal way to be able to address the issues with the minority rights, address the issues and concerns about both security and also self-governance questions. So it kind of encompasses all those package of issues um, to be able to um, balance it out with the territorial integrity of the state.
Okay. Um, this kind of well, first of all, I forgot to say something earlier. It isn't, of course, just about ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. There's also the issue of the ethnic Azerbaijani community that had to leave in the 90s. And it's said that there are discussions, private discussions, about the return, especially to Stepanakert, what Azerbaijanis called Khankendi, and also to Khojali district. Um, this also, however, presupposes that, first of all, the ethnic Armenian and ethnic Azerbaijani communities probably need to start speaking to each other. And also that maybe Baku needs to start speaking to the de facto Nagorno Karabakh authorities. However, this doesn't seem to be as positive as perhaps Armenia, Azerbaijan potential for normalization. For example, this week we saw the de facto authorities in Karabakh adopt a bill saying that the 7 regions outside Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast are occupied by Azerbaijan. And actually, some Armenian analysts, including one from Nagorno-Karabakh, said that this was the most dangerous thing that they could have done, which totally delegitimizes them in the eyes of the international community and also puts Armenia at a great disadvantage in any normalization talks with Azerbaijan. And it just strikes me that this issue is really going to be a very sensitive and very difficult one. And yet, by the terms of the 9 point ceasefire agreement, either I know people say the Russians never leave, but potentially we have the deadline of 2025 or 2030, and I just wonder: do you think we can actually resolve these issues by either of those dates?
I think it would be possible to resolve those issues if the countries will, Armenia and Azerbaijan, will step on the gas a little bit. I do understand the challenges to that process. I do think that it's not worth concentrating on the controversies around the Nagorno-Karabakh right now. I think it's the best way to go forward is through the normalization of the relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and see how that is going to impact and influence the dynamic of the situation around Nagorno-Karabakh itself. Um, if that is going to be positive, then I think uh, the issues that we're looking on right now will simply become irrelevant should the normalization happen. And I think right now there is that opportunity. I see the steps, very slow one, very grudging steps, but steps forward, especially when it comes from the Armenian side of the whole deal, to against all odds, against all the internal pressures, to go with the agreements on the unlocking of transport routes, especially when it comes to the train transportation, to try to push the issue forward on the car transportation, so to say, on the automobile connections, and to at least negotiate on the common work on the delimitation of the border, uh, which is, of course, I understand, linked to the whole question of the territorial integrity and the Nagorno Karabakh as a region. But again, those issues can be left uh, in a little bit of a suspense to give the chance to the issues where the connections have already been established to come to fruition and to positively impact the later stage for the resolution of the other outstanding issues. That is my hopeful, so to say, framework that I have in my head. Maybe I am over optimistic, but in as many years as I've been looking at this conflict, that's the first time I'm truly hopeful that there is a gateway towards the positive change.
So I agree with you, and I hope that economic interdependency will be a major factor, something that has never existed before, in fact. I think I also agree with effectively deferring this issue, until a later date when everything else is in place. And I felt like that for well over a decade now. And arguably, it could be said that Levon Petrosyan came to realize this in 1997, and unfortunately, it led to his downfall. And a lot of time was wasted since. And Gerard Liberidian has always made the point that he believes that it will be some kind of non-territorial autonomous status for the ethnic Armenians, or I mean, again, we should point out that there will be ethnic Azerbaijanis at some point, but for the majority ethnic Armenian community. And he talks about it being something similar to, say, the ethnic Armenians living in Istanbul. If you'd like to add on to anything that I just said there, or in fact, if you'd like to add anything to end, even if it's your hopes maybe for the future.
Well, I think that there is a, a lot to do in the relationship between the states, but I think mending those relations first and foremost, normalizing them somehow, is the path forward right now, the most obvious and the most credible path forward right now. And that would also mean that at some point the negotiations about the fate of the Azerbaijani and Armenian community in Nagorno-Karabakh and how that is going to look is going to be not uh, competitive but cooperative. So at some point it might become uh, a common interest rather than the dividing factor, and that's what I'm hoping to see from the process of normalization between Armenia and Azerbaijan, that the issue becomes equally positively important for both states.
So Richard Girogosyan always says, and although he's specifically talking about Armenia-Turkey normalization, that normalization does not mean reconciliation, and that it is actually the minimum that needs to happen, and then only then can it be built upon. Um, I guess you would probably agree with that.
Yes, I agree with Richard on that part, but I mean, uh, it is true that without normalization, the reconciliation is not possible. And reconciliation is a slow and painful process, and it should be considered as such, and it should be accepted as such. And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be painless, and it's not going to be without hiccups. But without a normalization of relations between the states, because this conflict is territorial, it is between the two states, and all the other issues have been built upon that foundation. Without getting that out of the picture, without establishing the relations where the Armenian Azerbaijan can cooperate and not compete, it would not be possible to start this process of reconciliation. I'm not saying that it should not be attempted, because again, every positive change counts, but the final success of the reconciliation is not possible without normalization, and it's not uh, possible in a very short time, in the short term. The reconciliation is, unfortunately, a long term process, and this should be accepted, I would say, without pointing to the situation where, oh, it's not working, let's not do it. No, we should definitely do it, but we should all be ready that it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And that's how it should be perceived and taken upon the shoulders of both peoples, because that's where they have responsibility even more than the two states have.
And I think that's an excellent point to end on. Kamal, a great pleasure to finally speak to you, and I hope one day we can discuss all these things in person.
I think so too. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast, and I hope to speaking to you soon.